Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, yet still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or simply looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. Now, we all complain about modern dating, right? Apps that don't work, ghosting, awkward small talk over overpriced coffee. But imagine if your biggest dating worry wasn't whether someone would text you back, but whether they'd survive the winter. Imagine if meeting the parents meant literally asking permission from a feudal lord who owned your potential partner like property. Or if your idea of romance involved checking each other for open sores and hoping neither of you had been accused of witchcraft recently. The truth is, medieval dating was so brutal that it makes today's worst Tinder horror stories look like fairy tales. We're talking about an era where love was a luxury most couldn't afford, where marriages were business transactions, and where the average person had about as much say in their romantic life as livestock, being traded at market. Over the next few parts, we're going to uncover exactly why finding love in medieval times was an absolute nightmare. We'll explore how the rigid class system turned romance into a political chess game, how the Catholic Church controlled every aspect of intimate relationships, and how basic hygiene issues made physical attraction, well, challenging, to say the least. But here's what's really shocking. Many of the dating problems we think are uniquely modern actually have their roots in these medieval disasters. The pressure to marry young, a medieval invention. Arranged relationships, they basically created the template. Even the idea that romance should be this dramatic, tortured experience comes straight from medieval courtly love traditions that were designed to be impossible to fulfill. Let's start with something that would make modern dating apps seem like paradise: the complete and utter lack of choice that defined medieval romance. If you think your dating pool is limited now, imagine living in a village of maybe 50 people, where half are related to you, a quarter are already married, and the rest are either too young, too old, or have been claimed by the local lord for political marriages. In medieval society, your romantic options weren't determined by compatibility, shared interests, or even basic attraction. They were determined by your social class, your family's financial situation, and often by people who had never even met you. The idea of dating around, getting to know different people, or heaven forbid marrying for love, that was not just rare. It was considered dangerous and potentially heretical. For peasants, who made up about 90% of the population, romance was essentially a luxury they couldn't afford. When you're working from sunrise to sunset just to survive, when a bad harvest means your family starves, and when your entire life is controlled by a feudal lord who sees you as barely more than property, finding love becomes a secondary concern to finding someone who can help you not die. Most peasant marriages were arranged by families based on practical considerations. Can this person work the land? Do they come with a dowry of livestock or tools? Are they healthy enough to bear children and work until they drop dead in their 30s? Romance wasn't even part of the equation, because it was seen as a dangerous distraction from the serious business of survival. And here's where it gets really dark. Even if you did find someone you genuinely cared about, there was no guarantee you'd be allowed to marry them. Feudal lords had the right to approve or deny marriages among their serfs, and they often used this power as a form of control. If you were a productive worker, your lord might refuse to let you marry someone from another village because losing you would hurt his economic interests. But surely the nobility had it better, right? They had wealth, power, and the luxury of choice that peasants could only dream of. Well, not exactly. If anything, noble marriages were even more calculated and loveless than peasant ones, because the stakes were so much higher. When you're part of the ruling class, your marriage isn't just about your personal happiness. It's about military alliances, territorial control, and political power that could affect thousands of people. Noble children, especially daughters, were essentially treated as valuable trading cards in a complex game of medieval politics. A young noble woman might find herself betrothed to a man she'd never met, possibly decades older than her, purely because her marriage would secure a military alliance or settle a territorial dispute. Her feelings about this arrangement were not just irrelevant expressing. Dissatisfaction could be seen as treason against her family's interests. And let's talk about age, because this is where medieval dating gets truly disturbing by modern standards. The concept of childhood as we understand it didn't really exist in medieval times. Girls were often betrothed as young as 7 years old, with marriages typically consummated when they reached what was considered marriageable age, which was often as young as 12 or 13. These weren't marriages between children, which would have been unusual even then. These were marriages between young girls and often much older men, arranged for political or economic reasons. A 12-year-old girl might find herself married to a 30-year-old man she'd met once at the betrothal ceremony, expected to manage a household, bear children, and navigate complex political relationships while still being, by any reasonable standard, a child herself. The mortality rates tell the whole horrifying story. Many young women died in childbirth, not just because medieval medicine was primitive, but because their bodies simply weren't ready for pregnancy and childbirth. The pressure to produce male heirs meant that surviving a first pregnancy was often followed immediately by attempts at a second, then a third, until either a son was born or the woman died trying. For men, the situation wasn't much better, just different. Young noblemen might have slightly more freedom in their romantic choices, but they were still expected to marry for political advantage rather than personal preference. And if they were younger sons with no inheritance prospects, they might be forced into the church, whether they had a religious calling or not, effectively removing them from the marriage market entirely. But here's what makes this even more twisted. The medieval period, actually, invented the concept of romantic love that still tortures us today. The tradition of courtly love, popularized by troubadours and poets, created this idealized vision of romance that was deliberately designed to be impossible to achieve. Courtly love typically involved a knight falling desperately in love with a married noble woman, then spending years performing increasingly elaborate acts of devotion, while never actually consummating the relationship. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a social safety valve that allowed people to fantasize about passionate romance while maintaining the rigid marriage structures that kept society stable. The problem is, this tradition created the idea that true love should be tortured, impossible, and preferably tragic. It gave us the notion that if love comes too easily, it's not real love. Sound familiar? This medieval invention is still messing with our heads today, making us think that healthy, straightforward relationships are somehow less romantic than dramatic, complicated ones. As dawn broke over the cramped villages of medieval Europe, the harsh realities of courtship became even more apparent in the stark light of day. But if you think the social restrictions we discussed were bad, Wait until you hear about the physical dangers that came with medieval romance. Because in a world without modern medicine or basic hygiene, even holding hands could literally be a matter of life and death. Picture this. You're a young peasant woman, maybe 15 years old, and you've somehow managed to catch the eye of a local farmer's son. Your families have agreed to let you walk together after church on Sundays, always under the watchful gaze of your mother or aunt, of course. But as you stroll through the village, you're not just navigating the rocky path between the thatched cottages, you're walking through a minefield of disease, filth, and physical dangers that would make modern dating apps seem like a luxury spa experience. The streets beneath your feet aren't paved with cobblestones or even packed dirt. They're flowing rivers of human and animal waste, rotting food scraps, and God knows what else. The smell alone would knock a modern person unconscious. Pigs roam freely, rooting through garbage and relieving themselves wherever they please. Chickens scatter underfoot, leaving their own contributions to the aromatic symphony. And in the summer heat, the stench becomes so overwhelming that people regularly faint just from walking outside, but the smell is the least of your worries. Every step you take is potentially exposing you to deadly diseases that we've completely forgotten about today. Cholera lurks in the contaminated water wells. Dysentery spreads through poorly prepared food. And typhoid fever can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Black Death might have been the most famous killer of the medieval period, but it was just one player in a whole orchestra of diseases that could end your romantic dreams permanently. Now, imagine trying to have an intimate conversation with your potential suitor while navigating this biological wasteland. You can't exactly lean in close for a romantic whisper when the person next to you might be carrying any number of infectious diseases. And forget about that cute habit of sharing food or drinks. In medieval times, sharing a cup of ale with your beloved wasn't romantic, it was Russian roulette. The lack of basic dental hygiene meant that getting close enough for a kiss was an assault on all your senses. Without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or any understanding of oral hygiene, most people's breath was absolutely revolting. Teeth rotted out of people's heads by their 20s. Gums bled constantly. And the smell of decay was so common that it was just accepted as a normal part of human interaction. But let's say you're brave enough to overlook the apocalyptic state of medieval hygiene. Let's say you found someone whose company you genuinely enjoy, despite the fact that they smell like a combination of barnyard animals and rotting vegetables. You still have to contend with the physical dangers that lurked around every corner. Medieval towns and villages were not built with safety in mind. Buildings collapsed regularly because construction standards were basically non-existent. Fire was a constant threat because everything was made of wood and thatch, and people cooked over open flames inside their homes. A romantic evening by the firelight could quickly turn into a desperate fight for survival if a spark caught the wrong piece of straw. And then there were the human dangers. Medieval society was incredibly violent, and that violence wasn't restricted to battlefields or tavern brawls. Domestic violence was not only common, it was legally protected. A husband could beat his wife with virtually no consequences, as long as he didn't kill her outright. Women had no legal recourse, no shelters to flee to, and no economic independence that would allow them to escape abusive relationships. Even if your romantic interest seemed kind and gentle during your carefully supervised courtship, there was no way to know what kind of person they would become once you were legally bound to them. Marriage was a permanent contract with no escape clause, and many women discovered too late that their husbands were violent, cruel, or simply indifferent to their well-being. The physical act of intimacy itself was fraught with dangers that we can barely comprehend today. Without any understanding of sexual health or reproduction, without contraception or proper medical care, every romantic encounter was potentially life-threatening. Sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through medieval populations, causing everything from painful sores to madness to death. For women, pregnancy was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. It's estimated that between 1 in 10 and 1 in 4 women died in childbirth, and those who survived often suffered from complications that plagued them for the rest of their lives. Imagine trying to enjoy your wedding night, knowing that every act of intimacy could lead to a pregnancy that might kill you. And if you did survive childbirth, you'd likely face it again and again. Without reliable contraception, most married women were pregnant almost constantly from their wedding day until menopause or death, whichever came first. The average medieval woman who survived to adulthood could expect to give birth to 6 or 7 children, though many of those children wouldn't survive their first year. The infant mortality rate was so high that parents often didn't even name their children until they were several months old, because the chances of the baby dying were simply too great to risk the emotional attachment. Imagine the psychological toll of losing child after child, of never knowing if this pregnancy would be the one that killed you, of watching your body break down from the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. But even if you managed to navigate all these physical dangers, even if you found a partner who was kind and gentle, even if you survived multiple pregnancies and childbirth, you still had to contend with the simple, brutal fact that life in medieval times was short and unpredictable. The average life expectancy was somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. This wasn't because people aged faster, but because so many died young from disease, violence, or accidents that had dragged down the average. If you were lucky enough to survive childhood, you might live to see 50 or 60, but you'd be considered ancient by medieval standards. This meant that most romantic relationships were tragically brief. You might marry at 15 and be widowed by 25. You might finally find true love only to watch your partner waste away from a disease that would be easily treatable today. The constant presence of death cast a shadow over every relationship, every moment of happiness. And yet, despite all these overwhelming obstacles, despite the disease and violence and early death, people still fell in love. They still wrote poetry and sang songs about their beloved. They still risked everything for a chance at happiness, however brief it might be. In some ways, this makes medieval romance more poignant, not less. When life was so uncertain and death was always lurking just around the corner, every moment of connection, every gentle touch, every shared smile became infinitely precious. People didn't have the luxury of taking love for granted, because they knew how quickly it could be snatched away. But it also meant that romantic relationships were often desperate and intense in ways that we might find uncomfortable today. When you might only have a few years together, when pregnancy could be a death sentence, when disease could strike at any moment, love became a high-stakes gamble with everything on the line. While clan warfare, church oppression, and social constraints made daily life unbearable, perhaps nowhere was medieval brutality more apparent than in the realm of romance and relationships. If you thought modern dating was complicated, imagine trying to find love in an era where a simple kiss could literally kill you, where marriages were business transactions, and where the very act of courtship was governed by a toxic mix of religious zealotry and aristocratic manipulation. The medieval approach to love and marriage was so fundamentally twisted that it would, make even the most dysfunctional modern relationship look like a fairy tale. This wasn't just about arranged marriages or lack of choice. This was a systematic destruction of human intimacy wrapped in the false promise of chivalric romance and divine blessing. Let's start with the most basic element of any romantic relationship: physical attraction and intimacy. In medieval times, even the slightest physical contact between unmarried individuals was considered a grave sin that could damn your soul for eternity. The Catholic Church had turned human sexuality into something so shameful and terrifying that people genuinely believed a passionate kiss might send them straight to hell. But it wasn't just religious guilt that made physical intimacy dangerous. It was literally life-threatening. Without any understanding of hygiene or disease transmission, intimate contact was a game of Russian roulette. Sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through medieval society, and there was no treatment, no cure, and often no understanding of how these ailments spread. Syphilis, which arrived in Europe during the late medieval period, was particularly devastating. The disease would eat away at people's faces, leaving them hideously disfigured before driving them insane and ultimately killing them. Imagine trying to build a romantic relationship when physical intimacy carried the very real risk of a slow, agonizing death. For women, the dangers were even more extreme. Pregnancy was essentially a death sentence that you might survive. Maternal mortality rates were astronomical, with some estimates suggesting that 1 in 3 women died during childbirth. This wasn't just about lack of medical knowledge. Medieval society actively made pregnancy more dangerous through their beliefs and practices. Medieval medical texts claimed that women were essentially defective men, with bodies that were cold and wet rather than hot and dry. This fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy meant that medical treatments for pregnant women were often harmful or deadly. Physicians might prescribe bloodletting to balance the humors or recommend herbs that were actually toxic to developing fetuses. The church made things worse by teaching that the pain of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's original sin. This meant that attempts to ease labor pain were considered blasphemous. Women were expected to suffer in agony as a form of divine penance, and any attempt to reduce their pain was seen as interfering with God's will. But let's say you survived courtship, avoided disease, and made it through pregnancy alive. The actual structure of medieval marriage was designed to crush any possibility of genuine love or partnership. Marriage wasn't about two people choosing each other. It was a business transaction between families, with the bride as the commodity being traded. Fathers would negotiate bride prices and dowries like they were selling livestock. The bride herself had no say in the matter. She might meet her husband for the first time on her wedding day. Or worse, she might be married to a man she found repulsive or terrifying. Her feelings, her desires, her hopes for the future were completely irrelevant. The age at which these marriage negotiations began was particularly horrifying. Girls as young as 7 years old could be betrothed, and marriages were often consummated when the bride reached 12 or 13. These weren't marriages between children and other children. These were often arrangements between young girls and much older men, sometimes men old enough to be their grandfathers. Consider the case of Margaret Beaufort, who was married for the first time at age 6. She was widowed at age 7, remarried at age 9, and gave birth to her only child, the future King Henry VII, when she was just 13 years old. The traumatic birth left her unable to have more children and caused lifelong health problems. This wasn't unusual. This was the normal experience for noblewomen, For peasant women, the situation was different, but no less awful. While they might have slightly more say in their marriages, their options were still severely limited by economic necessity and social pressure. A peasant woman who remained unmarried was essentially condemned to a life of poverty and vulnerability. She had no legal rights, no means of supporting herself, and no protection from violence or exploitation. The economic realities of medieval life meant that marriages were primarily about survival rather than love. Families needed to pool resources to have any hope of making it through famines, diseases, and the constant threat of violence. Romance was a luxury that most people simply couldn't afford, even among the nobility, where there was theoretically more freedom and resources. The political implications of marriage made genuine love nearly impossible. Noble marriages were diplomatic alliances designed to secure territory, forge military partnerships, or end conflicts between warring families. The personal happiness of the bride and groom was irrelevant compared to these larger political considerations. This led to the bizarre medieval concept of courtly love, which was essentially a systematic romanticization of adultery. Since marriages were political arrangements rather than love matches, the only way to experience passionate romance was through affairs. Courtly love literature celebrated these extramarital relationships, creating an entire culture that worshipped forbidden love while simultaneously condemning it. The stories of courtly love were filled with impossible, tragic romances. Knights would pledge their eternal devotion to married ladies, pine away for love they could never have, and perform great deeds in honor of women they could never touch. These weren't stories about healthy relationships. These were fantasies about the very impossibility of love in medieval society. Take the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, which became one of the most famous examples of courtly love. Lancelot, the greatest knight of the Round Table, falls desperately in love with Queen Guinevere, who is married to his lord and friend, King Arthur. Their love is presented as noble and pure precisely because it can never be consummated without destroying everything they both hold dear. The story ends in tragedy, with their forbidden love ultimately leading to the downfall of Camelot itself. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were a reflection of the fundamental impossibility of combining love and marriage in medieval society. The very concept of romantic love was associated with tragedy, impossibility, and destruction. Love was something that happened outside of marriage, and marriage was something that happened without love, even for those fortunate enough to find love within the confines of marriage. The medieval world presented countless threats to romantic happiness. Disease was perhaps the cruelest enemy of all lasting relationships. The average lifespan hovered around 30 years, meaning that most couples could expect their unions to be cut tragically short. A husband might watch helplessly as his wife succumbed to childbirth complications, or a bride might find herself widowed before her 20th birthday when plague swept through their village. The Black Death alone destroyed millions of families across Europe. Imagine the horror of watching your beloved develop the telltale black swellings, knowing that within days they would be gone forever. Chronicles from the period describe entire households wiped out, leaving only empty beds and broken hearts. In some villages, so many died that there weren't enough survivors left to bury the dead properly. But disease wasn't the only threat stalking medieval lovers. Violence was a constant specter hanging over every relationship. Wars between kingdoms, feuds between noble houses, and simple banditry could tear couples apart at any moment. A young man might ride off to fight in his lord's army, promising to return to his sweetheart, only to fall on some distant battlefield. His beloved would wait and hope, perhaps for years, never knowing if he was alive or dead. The story of Eleanor and Thomas illustrates this tragic reality perfectly. Eleanor was the daughter of a minor lord, promised in marriage to secure a political alliance. But she had fallen deeply in love with Thomas, a knight in her father's service. Their secret meetings in the castle gardens were the stuff of troubadour songs, stolen kisses beneath the moonlight, whispered promises of eternal devotion, dreams of somehow being together despite the impossible circumstances. When Thomas volunteered to join a crusade to the Holy Land, Eleanor begged him not to go, but his honor demanded it. And besides, he hoped that distinguishing himself in battle might somehow earn him the right to ask for her hand. They spent one last night together before his departure, making vows that only God could witness. Thomas never returned. Word came back that he had died of fever in some foreign land, his body buried in unmarked ground far from home. Eleanor was forced to marry her intended betrothed as planned, but those who knew her said she never smiled again. She bore her husband 3 children and lived to see grandchildren, but part of her had died with Thomas in that distant desert. Such stories were heartbreakingly common in medieval times. Love was a luxury that few could afford to pursue, and even fewer could hope to keep. The harsh realities of life in this brutal era meant that happiness was always temporary, always under threat from forces beyond anyone's control. For the peasant classes, the situation was even more dire. A farmer's wife might lose her husband to accident, disease, or simple exhaustion from backbreaking labor. Without his protection and income, she would face destitution unless she could quickly remarry, but finding a new husband while caring for young children was no easy task. Many widows were forced to beg, steal, or sell themselves just to survive. The church offered little comfort to those suffering from broken hearts. In fact, religious doctrine taught that earthly love was a distraction from divine devotion. Priests preached that too much affection for one's spouse could damn the soul, as it took attention away from proper worship of God. Marriages were meant to be partnerships for survival and procreation, not unions of passion and romance. This created a terrible paradox for medieval couples. The very emotions that made life bearable, love, desire, joy in each other's company, were considered spiritually dangerous. Husbands and wives were expected to care for each other, but not too much. They could find comfort in companionship, but passionate love was seen as a sin that needed to be confessed and atoned for. The troubadour tradition of courtly love only made things worse for actual married couples. These elaborate fantasies of noble knights wooing unattainable ladies created impossible standards for real relationships. How could an exhausted farmer, competing with plowing fields, measure up to the romantic ideals sung about in great halls? How could his wife, worn down by childbirth and endless labor, feel beautiful when compared to the ethereal maidens of poetry? The gap between romantic fantasy and harsh reality was enormous. While minstrels sang of eternal devotion and pure love, actual couples struggled just to keep their families fed and alive. Romance was a privilege of the wealthy and idle, not something ordinary people could afford to indulge in. Even physical intimacy was fraught with danger and shame. The church taught that sexual desire, even between married couples, was inherently sinful. Intercourse was only permissible for procreation, and even then, it should be approached with reluctance and minimal pleasure. Couples were forbidden from intimacy during Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. When you calculate all the prohibited times, married couples were only supposed to be intimate for about 40 days per year. But perhaps most tragically of all, the constant threat of death meant that opening one's heart to love also meant accepting inevitable, devastating loss. In a world where children regularly died before their 5th birthday, where plague could strike without warning, where violence lurked around every corner, loving someone deeply was an act of extraordinary courage. Medieval people learned to guard their hearts out of necessity. Getting too attached to anyone, spouse, child, parent, or friend, was a recipe for unbearable grief. Yet somehow, despite all these obstacles and dangers, love persisted. People continued to fall for each other, to risk everything for stolen moments of happiness, to build lives together, knowing how fragile and temporary they might be. The letters and poems that survive from this period reveal the same longing, passion, and heartbreak that humans have always experienced. A merchant writing to his wife during a long journey, a mother mourning a child lost to fever, a young couple planning their future together. Their words echo across the centuries, reminding us that beneath all the harsh realities of medieval life, beat hearts that loved just as deeply as our own. As we reflect on these long-ago lovers, separated by death, duty, and circumstance, we can appreciate how fortunate we are to live in an age where love has a real chance to flourish, where medical care can extend our time together, where communication can bridge any distance, where we're free to choose our own partners and follow our hearts. The medieval world was indeed a nightmare for those seeking love, but their courage in loving anyway, despite impossible odds, perhaps makes their stories all the more beautiful and heartbreaking. Yet, even as love struggled to survive amid such brutality, the very act of courtship itself presented dangers that modern romantics could scarcely imagine. For in medieval times, the simple pursuit of affection could lead to violence, scandal, or even death. Consider the treacherous world of medieval matchmaking, where marriages were arranged like military alliances and courtship was a battlefield of competing interests. Young men seeking a bride faced not just the challenge of winning a woman's heart, but navigating a labyrinth of family politics that could turn deadly at a moment's notice. A poorly chosen romantic gesture or an unauthorized advance could spark blood feuds that lasted generations. The story of Thomas Dashby illustrates these perils perfectly. A minor knight's son in 14th century England, Thomas fell deeply in love with Margaret, the daughter of a rival family. Their secret courtship seemed innocent enough: stolen glances across the manor hall, whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves, the exchange of small tokens of affection. But when Margaret's father discovered their romance, he flew into a murderous rage. To him, his daughter's heart was not her own to give, but a valuable commodity to be traded for political advantage. Thomas had committed an unforgivable sin, attempting to steal what rightfully belonged to another man's negotiations. The enraged father challenged to single combat, and in the brutal melee that followed, both men lay dying in the mud, their blood mingling with the autumn rain. Margaret, the object of their affection, was married off within the month to a man 3 times her age, her own desires as irrelevant as morning mist. Such tragedies were commonplace in an era where love was viewed as a dangerous disruption to carefully laid plans. Young people learned early that their hearts were not their own, that romantic feelings were luxuries the practical world could not afford. Very language of medieval courtship reflected this harsh reality. A man did not woo a woman, he negotiated for her. Parents did not consider their children's happiness. They calculated dowries and bloodlines. Even when families approved of a match, the actual process of medieval courtship was fraught with peculiar dangers and bizarre customs that seem almost comical today, yet were deadly serious then. Take the practice of bundling, common in colder regions, where courting couples were encouraged to share a bed while fully clothed, sometimes with a wooden board placed between them. The theory was that this allowed intimate conversation while preserving virtue, but in practice, it led to countless scandals, unwanted pregnancies, and shotgun weddings that began in resentment rather than love. The medieval obsession with virginity created its own nightmarish complications for young lovers. Women lived under constant surveillance, their every move scrutinized for signs of impropriety. A simple conversation with a man could ruin a woman's reputation forever, while actual physical intimacy before marriage could result in public shaming, exile, or worse. The pressure was so intense that some women resorted to dangerous herbal concoctions or primitive surgical procedures to fake their virginity on their wedding night, risking death from infection or poisoning. Men faced their own brutal expectations. They were required to prove their worthiness through displays of martial prowess that often ended in crippling injury or death. Tournaments, supposedly chivalrous affairs, were in reality blood-soaked spectacles where young knights died trying to impress their beloveds. The romantic ideal of the knight-errant, wandering the land in search of adventure to prove his love, was built on a foundation of very real corpses. The economic realities of medieval marriage added another layer of cruelty to romantic pursuits. Love matches were seen as selfish indulgences that weakened family fortunes and destabilized social order. A peasant who married for love might find himself cast out by his lord, left to starve with his beloved. A noble who defied his family's wishes could be disinherited, stripped of lands and title, reduced to beggary overnight. The church, supposedly the guardian of marriage as a sacred institution, often made courtship even more treacherous with its labyrinthine rules about who could marry whom. Complex laws governing blood relations meant that couples might discover, sometimes years into their relationship, that they were too closely related to wed. The dispensations required to overcome such obstacles were expensive and time-consuming, available only to the wealthy and well-connected. Religious festivals, ostensibly times of joy and celebration, became hunting grounds for predatory men seeking to exploit the temporary relaxation of social boundaries. Young women attending church gatherings or village fairs faced constant threats of assault or abduction. Many families kept their daughters virtually imprisoned during such events, viewing the risk of social interaction as simply too great. Even successful courtships that led to approved marriages were shadowed by the grim statistics of medieval life. The bride and groom exchanging vows could reasonably expect that one of them would be dead within a decade, victim of disease, childbirth complications, or violence. Wedding celebrations had an undertone of desperate urgency, as if the participants knew they were racing against time itself. The wedding night, supposedly the culmination of courtship, was often a traumatic ordeal, especially for young brides who might be completely ignorant of what awaited them. In an age without effective contraception, pregnancy was almost inevitable, and with it came a terrifying mortality rate. For many women, marriage was quite literally a death sentence, delivered with flowers and music. Those who survived the early years of marriage found that medieval domestic life offered little respite from danger. Domestic violence was not just tolerated, but legally sanctioned. Husbands had the right to chastise their wives with physical force, and the line between discipline and abuse was drawn by the husband alone. Women who complained too loudly about their treatment might find themselves accused of witchcraft or adultery, charges that could result in execution. The isolation of medieval households meant that abused spouses had little recourse and nowhere to flee. Extended family members were often more concerned with maintaining family honor than protecting vulnerable relatives. The church preached submission and endurance, offering the cold comfort that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. Children born of these troubled unions faced their own romantic doom. Raised in households where love was rare and violence common, they learned early that relationships were about power and survival, rather than affection and companionship. The cycle of loveless, brutal marriages perpetuated itself generation after generation, creating a society where genuine intimacy was almost impossible to achieve. Yet perhaps most tragically, there were those who did find true love in this harsh world, only to watch helplessly as circumstances beyond their control tore them apart. Star-crossed lovers separated by war, plague, or family feuds became the stuff of legend precisely because their stories resonated with so many who had experienced similar heartbreak. The literature of the period is filled with tales of lovers who chose death rather than separation. Romeo and Juliet being merely the most famous example of a theme that appeared countless times in medieval romance. These stories spoke to a deep human longing for connection that even the brutal realities of medieval life could not entirely extinguish. If you thought the rigid marriage arrangements and brutal customs we've explored were the worst of medieval romance, we're about to delve into something even more disturbing. Beyond the social restrictions and political machinations lay a web of superstitions, religious hysteria, and paranormal beliefs that turned the simple act of falling in love into a potential death sentence. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval cottage, a young woman named Isabel carefully braided herbs into her hair, whispering ancient words her grandmother had taught her. She wasn't casting spells or communing with dark forces. She was simply trying to attract the attention of Thomas, the blacksmith's son, using folk remedies that had been passed down through generations of village women. But in an age where the line between medicine and magic was razor thin, such innocent actions could easily be misconstrued as witchcraft. The medieval world was absolutely saturated with supernatural beliefs that directly impacted romantic relationships. Love itself was often viewed through a lens of suspicion and fear. If someone fell suddenly and passionately in love, it might be attributed to love potions, enchantments, or demonic influence rather than natural attraction. Women in particular were seen as susceptible to supernatural manipulation, and any woman who displayed unusual beauty, intelligence, or independence risked being branded as a witch or sorceress. The church's teachings on sexuality created an atmosphere of terror around physical desire. Lust was considered one of the 7 deadly sins, and any intense romantic or sexual feeling could be interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or corruption. This meant that the very emotions that draw people together were treated as dangerous spiritual threats. Young people were taught to be deeply suspicious of their own feelings, creating a psychological minefield around the development of romantic relationships. Consider the plight of a young man named Edmund who lived in 14th century England. When he found himself powerfully attracted to a local merchant's daughter, he didn't celebrate these feelings or see them as natural human emotions. Instead, he was tormented by the possibility that his desires were sinful, that he was being tempted by Satan, or that the woman herself might be using supernatural means to ensnare him. This kind of psychological torture was commonplace, turning what should have been a joyous romantic awakening into a source of guilt, fear, and spiritual crisis. The belief in love magic was both widespread and dangerous. It was commonly accepted that certain individuals, particularly older women with knowledge of herbs and folk remedies, could create potions and spells to influence romantic feelings. While some of these beliefs led to harmless folk practices, they also created a climate where women could be accused of witchcraft for the most innocent actions. A woman who was skilled in herbalism, who lived alone, or who was simply disliked by her neighbors, could find herself facing accusations of using supernatural powers to manipulate men's affections. Witch trials that plagued Europe from the 5th, 10th through 17th centuries had a devastating impact on romantic relationships. Women lived in constant fear that their actions, words, or even their appearance might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural powers. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and terror that poisoned relationships between men and women. Men were taught to be wary of women who were too beautiful, too intelligent, or too independent, as these qualities might indicate supernatural influence. The legal system provided no protection for those accused of love magic or witchcraft. The burden of proof was often reversed, requiring the accused to prove their innocence rather than requiring accusers to prove guilt. Confessions were extracted through torture, and the methods used to identify witches were based on superstition rather than evidence. A woman might be condemned to death simply because a man claimed she had bewitched him into loving her, or because someone in the community believed she had used magic to steal another woman's husband. The story of Agnes Waterhouse, one of the first women executed for witchcraft in England in 1566, illustrates how romantic relationships could become entangled with accusations of supernatural crime. Agnes was an elderly widow who lived alone and was known for her knowledge of herbal remedies. When several young men in her village experienced unrequited love or romantic disappointments, rumors began to spread that Agnes was using magic to interfere with their romantic lives. The accusations escalated until she was arrested, tried, and executed for witchcraft. Despite the complete lack of credible evidence against her, the fear of supernatural influence extended to every aspect of courtship and marriage. Wedding ceremonies included numerous rituals and protections designed to ward off evil spirits and malicious magic. Brides wore specific colors, carried particular herbs, or performed certain actions to protect themselves from supernatural interference. The wedding night itself was surrounded by superstitions and protective rituals, as it was believed to be a particularly vulnerable time when evil forces might try to curse the union or prevent consummation. Even the simple act of gift-giving between lovers was fraught with supernatural implications. A ring, a lock of hair, or a pressed flower could be interpreted as a magical charm or a component in a love spell. Young people had to be extremely careful about what they gave to or received from romantic interests, as innocent tokens of affection could later be used as evidence of witchcraft if the relationship went sour. If someone wanted to make accusations, belief in the evil eye added another layer of danger to romantic relationships. It was widely believed that certain individuals could curse others simply by looking at them with malicious intent. This meant that jealous rivals, disappointed suitors, or disapproving family members could be blamed for romantic misfortunes through supernatural means. If a couple experienced problems in their relationship, if a pregnancy ended in miscarriage, or if one partner fell ill, it might be attributed to the evil eye rather than natural causes. The concept of demonic possession also impacted romantic relationships in terrifying ways. Young women who displayed unusual behavior, particularly if it involved rejecting arranged marriages or expressing strong romantic preferences, might be accused of being possessed by demons. The treatments for such possession were brutal and often fatal, involving exorcisms, beatings, starvation, and other forms of torture designed to drive out the supposed evil spirits. Religious authorities actively promoted these supernatural fears as a way of controlling romantic and sexual behavior, teaching people to be suspicious of their own emotions and to fear supernatural influence in their relationships. Intersection of medicine and magic created additional dangers for those seeking help with romantic problems. Herbalists, midwives, and folk healers who provided remedies for lovesickness, infertility, or other romantic difficulties were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Even physicians and learned men could find themselves accused of using supernatural means if their treatments were too successful, or if they were associated with romantic scandals. The psychological impact of living under such superstitious terror cannot be overstated. Young people grew up believing that their most natural and fundamental emotions were potentially dangerous, that expressions of love might be evidence of supernatural corruption, and that romantic relationships were constantly threatened by invisible malevolent forces. This created a culture of fear and suspicion that made genuine intimacy and trust nearly impossible to achieve. The documentation from medieval and early modern court records reveals the devastating human cost of these supernatural beliefs. Countless women were tortured and executed on charges related to love magic or romantic witchcraft. Families were torn apart by accusations and suspicions. Communities were divided by fear and paranoia. The very bonds that should have brought people together became sources of danger and terror. The irony is that many of the practices condemned as supernatural were actually based on genuine knowledge of herbs, psychology, and human behavior. Women who understood how to use certain plants to improve health, who could read people's emotions and provide good advice, or who simply had the confidence to live independently, were often the ones accused of witchcraft. The systematic persecution of such women represented not just an attack on individuals, but a broader assault on female knowledge and autonomy. The belief in supernatural influence also served as a convenient excuse for men who wanted to escape responsibility for their romantic choices. A man who abandoned his wife for another woman could claim he had been bewitched. A nobleman who broke an engagement could argue that he had been under supernatural influence. These accusations allowed men to avoid the social and legal consequences of their actions while simultaneously destroying the lives of the women they blamed. The fear of love magic extended even to the highest levels of society. Royal marriages were surrounded by elaborate protective rituals, and court physicians were constantly on guard against supernatural threats to royal romantic relationships. Kings and queens employed specialists in counter magic to protect against romantic curses, and political enemies might be accused of using supernatural means to interfere with royal marriages or fertility. The artistic and literary culture of the medieval period both reflected and reinforced these supernatural fears. Stories of enchantresses, love potions, and magical seduction were extremely popular, but they also served to reinforce the idea that romantic relationships were inherently dangerous and potentially supernatural in nature. Young people absorbed these cultural messages, learning to view their own romantic experiences through a lens of suspicion and fear. The legal codes of medieval Europe reveal how thoroughly supernatural beliefs had penetrated the justice system. Laws against love magic were detailed and severe, with punishments ranging from fines and public humiliation to torture and execution. The fact that such laws existed and were regularly enforced demonstrates how seriously these supernatural threats were taken by medieval authorities. The economic impact of supernatural fears around romance was also significant. Families might spend considerable resources on protective charms, counterspells, and other supernatural defenses for their children's romantic relationships. The fear of magical interference could disrupt trade relationships, political alliances, and social connections as people became suspicious of anyone who might have supernatural motivations for their romantic advice or interference. Geographic spread of these beliefs was remarkable, extending across all of Europe and beyond. While specific practices and beliefs varied from region to region, the underlying fear of supernatural influence in romantic relationships was virtually universal. This suggests that these beliefs served important social and psychological functions, even as they caused tremendous suffering and injustice. As we reflect on this dark chapter in the history of human relationships, we see how the combination of ignorance, fear, and social control created a perfect storm of terror around the most basic human emotions. The medieval period's supernatural beliefs about love and romance represent perhaps the most extreme example in human history of how society can turn the natural desire for connection and intimacy into a source of mortal danger. The legacy of these beliefs extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing attitudes toward women, sexuality, and romantic relationships for centuries to come. The witch trials of the early modern period, the persecution of women healers and midwives, and the broader cultural suspicion of female independence all had their roots in the medieval period's supernatural fears around romance and sexuality. In examining this aspect of medieval romantic life, we gain insight not just into the past, but into the ongoing human tendency to fear and demonize what we don't understand. The medieval period's supernatural beliefs about love remind us of how dangerous it can be when ignorance and fear are allowed to override reason and compassion, and how the most beautiful aspects of human experience can be twisted into sources of terror and persecution. The young woman Isabel, with whom we began this exploration, might have lived her entire life in fear that her innocent attempts to attract love would be misinterpreted as witchcraft. In a world where even the most natural human desires were viewed with supernatural suspicion, the simple act of falling in love became not just a personal risk, but a potential death sentence. This represents perhaps the cruelest irony of medieval romantic life, that the very emotions that make us most human were treated as evidence of inhuman corruption. Perhaps the cruelest twist of fate for medieval lovers was how death itself seemed to lurk around every romantic corner. In an age where life expectancy barely reached 30 for the common folk, finding love was often a race against time itself. Young women who managed to catch the eye of a suitor faced the terrifying prospect of childbirth, which killed more mothers than any battlefield-claimed soldiers. The crude understanding of anatomy and complete absence of sterile birthing practices meant that bringing forth the fruit of love often became a death sentence. Consider the tragic tale of Marguerite de Montclair, a noblewoman whose story was recorded in the chronicles of 13th century France. At 17, she was considered ancient by medieval standards for marriage, having somehow avoided the typical arrangement that would have seen her wed at 14. When she finally fell genuinely in love with a young knight named Guillaume, their romance seemed blessed by fortune. They exchanged secret letters written in the flowery language of courtly love, met in hidden alcoves of her father's castle, and dreamed of a life together that transcended the usual political machinations of noble marriage. But their love story, like so many others, was destined for heartbreak. When Marguerite became pregnant with their child, what should have been a moment of joy became a countdown to catastrophe. Medieval childbirth was a barbaric affair, conducted by midwives whose knowledge came more from superstition than science. They believed that a difficult labor could be eased by hanging eagle stones around the mother's neck, or that placing a knife under the birthing bed would cut the pain. When complications arose, as they inevitably did, their solutions were often worse than the problems they tried to solve. Marguerite labored for 3 agonizing days while Guillaume paced frantically outside her chamber door. The midwives burned aromatic herbs and chanted prayers, but they were powerless against the medical emergency unfolding before them. When she finally succumbed to what we now know was likely sepsis or hemorrhaging, Guillaume was left not only heartbroken, but also blamed by her family for her death. In their grief and rage, they accused him of bewitching their daughter, of leading her astray with unholy desires that God had punished with death. This wasn't an isolated tragedy, but rather the grim reality for countless medieval couples. Even if lovers managed to navigate the treacherous waters of social expectations, religious restrictions, and family politics, they still had to contend with the simple biological fact that love in the Middle Ages was often cut short by death. Infectious diseases swept through communities with terrifying regularity, claiming young and old alike. The Black Death alone killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, leaving behind countless widows and widowers who had barely begun their lives. Together, the constant presence of death created a peculiar intensity to medieval romance. Lovers couldn't afford the luxury of long courtships or gradual emotional development. When life could end at any moment from plague, injury, or childbirth, every stolen kiss carried the weight of potential finality. This urgency infused medieval love poetry with a desperate quality that modern readers often find both beautiful and heartbreaking. The famous troubadour songs of unrequited love weren't just artistic conceits but reflections of a world where love was frequently interrupted by the grave. But death wasn't the only specter haunting medieval romance. The very act of falling in love was considered dangerous to one's spiritual well-being. The medieval church taught that passionate love was a form of spiritual sickness that could lead the soul astray from its proper devotion to God. This created an impossible paradox for young people whose hearts naturally yearned for connection and intimacy. They were told that the very feelings that made them most human were also the feelings most likely to damn them for eternity. The concept of romantic love as a positive force was so foreign to medieval thinking that when it began to emerge in the 12th century through the literature of courtly love, it was revolutionary and dangerous. The idea that a man might worship a woman with the same fervor typically reserved for the Virgin Mary was scandalous. The notion that sexual desire could be ennobling rather than degrading challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval Christianity. Yet even this supposedly elevated form of love was fraught with peril, as it was typically adulterous in nature, celebrated the suffering of unfulfilled desire, and often ended in tragedy. The troubadour tradition that gave birth to our modern conception of romantic love was built on the foundation of impossible relationships. The knight who loved his lord's wife, the lady who pined for a man she could never marry, the young lovers separated by class or circumstance. These weren't seen as problems to be solved, but as the very essence of pure love. The idea was that love became more perfect the more it was denied physical fulfillment, creating a culture that simultaneously celebrated and tortured young hearts. Medieval medical theory added another layer of danger to the act of falling in love. Physicians believed that intense emotion could literally make a person sick, and love sickness was considered a genuine medical condition with potentially fatal consequences. The symptoms included loss of appetite, insomnia, fever, and what we might now recognize as severe depression. The prescribed treatments were often as dangerous as the condition itself, involving bloodletting, purging, and the administration of powerful herbs could poison as easily as heal. The story of Abelard and Heloise, perhaps the most famous lovers of the medieval period, illustrates how intellectual and emotional connection could be just as dangerous as physical passion. Their love affair began as a tutorial relationship when the brilliant philosopher Abelard was hired to tutor the equally brilliant Heloise. Their intellectual connection blossomed into romantic love, which led to a secret marriage and a child. But when Heloise's uncle discovered their relationship, he had Abelard brutally castrated as punishment. The lovers were forced apart, with Heloise entering a convent and Abelard becoming a monk, spending the rest of their lives exchanging heart-wrenching letters that spoke of a love that could never be fully realized. Their story became legendary, not because it ended happily, but because it didn't. Medieval audiences understood that true love was supposed to end in suffering. The idea that lovers might live happily ever after was not just unrealistic, but somehow cheapened the very concept of love. This cultural expectation meant that young people entering into romantic relationships did so with the understanding that heartbreak was not just possible, but probable. The violence that surrounded medieval romance wasn't limited to the dramatic gestures of jealous husbands or protective families. Even consensual relationships were conducted within a framework of physical danger that is difficult for modern people to comprehend. The simple act of meeting secretly could result in accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy, any of which could lead to torture and execution. Young women who showed too much independence in matters of the heart risked being labeled as wanton or possessed, while young men could find themselves accused of seduction, rape, or corruption of innocence. The legal system offered little protection for lovers who found themselves on the wrong side of social expectations. Women had virtually no legal rights when it came to matters of marriage and sexuality. They could be married off against their will, divorced without cause, or accused of adultery on the flimsiest of evidence. Men faced different but equally serious dangers, particularly if they dared to love above their social station or to interfere with the marital plans of powerful families. Even the physical spaces were medieval. People lived conspired against romantic privacy. Most people lived in one-room houses shared with extended family and livestock. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford, and intimate conversations had to be conducted under the watchful eyes of parents, siblings, and neighbors. The romantic ideal of stolen moments and secret meetings was born partly from necessity, as there were few other options for couples who wanted to express their feelings away from the prying eyes of society. Economic realities of medieval life added yet another layer of complexity to romantic relationships. Love might bloom between two hearts, but marriage was fundamentally an economic transaction that involved the transfer of property, the formation of political alliances, and the continuation of family lines. Even among the peasantry, where romantic considerations might theoretically have more weight, practical concerns about combining resources and establishing viable households often trumped matters of the heart. This economic framework meant that falling in love with the wrong person wasn't just emotionally devastating, it could be financially ruinous for entire families. A young woman who refused an advantageous marriage in favor of a love match might find herself disinherited and cast out, with no means of supporting herself. A young man who pursued a woman above his station might face not only rejection, but also economic retaliation from her family and their allies. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life also imposed constraints on romance that are difficult for modern people to understand. Agricultural societies lived according to the demands of planting and harvest, with little time for leisure or courtship during the busiest periods of the year. Young people might meet during religious festivals or market days, but these brief encounters had to sustain relationships through long periods of separation and hard work. The harsh realities of medieval hygiene and medical care meant that even the most passionate lovers had to contend with physical conditions that would challenge any romantic relationship. Without effective treatments for dental problems, skin diseases, or infectious conditions, physical attraction was often fleeting. The romantic ideal of beauty was constantly undermined by the practical realities of bodies that aged quickly and suffered from conditions that modern medicine treats routinely. Yet, despite all these obstacles and dangers, love persisted in the medieval world with a tenacity that speaks to the fundamental human need for connection and intimacy. The very fact that romantic literature flourished during this period, that love songs were composed and sung despite the risks, that young people continued to fall in love despite the odds stacked against them, testifies to the power of human emotion to transcend even the most oppressive circumstances. The medieval lovers who dared to follow their hearts in the face of such overwhelming opposition were perhaps braver than any knight who ever rode into battle, for they fought against not just individual enemies, but against the entire structure of their society and the very conception of what it meant to be human in their time. Perhaps no aspect of medieval romance was more terrifying than the pervasive belief that love itself could be the work of dark magic. In a world where the supernatural lurked behind every shadow, where devils whispered temptations and witches brewed potions in moonlit forests, the very act of falling in love was viewed with deep suspicion and fear. The medieval mind saw enchantment everywhere, especially in matters of the heart. When a nobleman suddenly became infatuated with a serving girl, or when a merchant's wife abandoned her family for a wandering minstrel, the explanation was clear to all who witnessed it. Witchcraft was at work. Love potions, enchanted amulets, and demonic pacts were believed to be the true causes of romantic passion, not the natural stirrings of the human heart. Women bore the brunt of these accusations. Any woman who possessed unusual beauty, healing knowledge, or simply the misfortune to inspire intense desire was at risk of being branded a witch. The very qualities that made someone attractive: intelligence, independence, a way with herbs or animals, were precisely the traits that medieval society associated with supernatural malevolence. Consider the tragic tale of Marguerite Porete, a French mystic and author who lived in the late 13th century. Marguerite wrote passionate spiritual texts about divine love, describing her soul's union with God in language so fervent and sensual that it scandalized the church authorities. Her crime was not heresy in the traditional sense, but rather the dangerous act of a woman speaking openly about love, even divine love, with too much knowledge and too much passion. The Inquisition declared her a heretic, demanding she recant her writings and submit to male religious authority. When Marguerite refused to be silenced, refusing to acknowledge that her understanding of divine love was somehow corrupted or demonic, She was burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. Her books were ordered destroyed, though copies survived in secret, passed down by those who recognized the genuine spirituality in her words, rather than the supposed witchcraft her persecutors claimed to see. But Marguerite's fate was far from unique. Across medieval Europe, women who dared to speak of love, to practice healing arts, or to live independently faced similar accusations. The very act of inspiring desire in men was often seen as evidence of supernatural manipulation. If a married man abandoned his wife for another woman, the blame fell not on the man's choices, but on the supposed sorceress, who had ensnared him with her dark arts. The fear of love magic permeated every level of society. Noble families hired priests to bless their marriages and ward off enchantments. Merchants carried protective charms to guard against the seductive spells of foreign women in distant ports. Even peasants whispered prayers over their children's cradles, begging God to protect them from the evil eye of jealous neighbors who might curse them to lives of loneliness or destructive passion. This paranoia created a culture where genuine affection was constantly questioned and analyzed for signs of supernatural influence. Was a sudden attraction natural, or the result of a love potion slipped into wine? Did a woman's beauty come from God or from a pact with Satan? These questions tormented medieval minds, turning what should have been joyful experiences into sources of terror and suspicion. Church actively encouraged these fears, teaching that excessive passion was inherently sinful and likely demonic in origin. Priests warned their congregations that Satan used beautiful women as his primary weapons against righteous men, that lust was the devil's favorite tool for claiming souls. Love that burned too brightly, that defied social conventions or family arrangements, was automatically suspect. Medical texts of the era, influenced by both classical learning and Christian theology, described romantic love as a form of madness, a disease that clouded judgment and led to spiritual ruin. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, fasting, and prayer to cure those afflicted with what they termed amor herios, the sickness of excessive love. The symptoms they described, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts, were indeed real, but their understanding of the cause was filtered through a worldview that saw demonic influence in every strong emotion. This medicalization of love served to further stigmatize romantic passion, particularly for women. A woman who displayed too much desire, who seemed to enjoy physical intimacy, or who actively pursued a romantic relationship was likely to be diagnosed as either possessed by demons or practicing witchcraft herself. The cure often involved exorcism, public penance, or, in extreme cases, accusations of heresy that could lead to execution. The fear of love magic also created a thriving underground economy of supposed protection and counterspells. Wise women, despite the risks they faced, sold charms and potions to ward off unwanted romantic attention or to break perceived enchantments. Priests offered special masses and blessings for those who believed themselves bewitched by love. Ironically, the very people society turned to for protection from love magic were often the same individuals who would later be accused of practicing it. Young people growing up in this atmosphere learned to fear their own emotions. Natural sexual development was viewed through the lens of spiritual warfare, with parents and religious authorities constantly watching for signs that their children had fallen under malevolent influence. The awakening of romantic feelings, instead of being celebrated as a natural part of human development, became a source of shame and terror. The legal system reflected and reinforced these supernatural fears. Courts regularly heard cases involving accusations of love magic, with testimony often consisting of nothing more than the claim that someone had fallen in love inappropriately. The burden of proof was impossibly low. If a man abandoned his family for another woman, if a young person defied their parents' choice of spouse, if someone displayed what was considered excessive passion, these behaviors alone could serve as evidence of witchcraft. The punishments for convicted love witches were severe and designed to serve as public warnings. Women found guilty of using magic to inspire love were subjected to public humiliation, physical torture, and often death. Their supposed victims, usually men who had been bewitched into infidelity or inappropriate desire, were typically absolved of responsibility, treated as innocent parties who had been overcome by forces beyond their control. The system created a perfect mechanism for men to escape accountability for their romantic choices while simultaneously providing society with scapegoats for the disruptions that passionate love inevitably caused to carefully ordered social arrangements. A nobleman could abandon his arranged marriage for a more attractive partner and claim he had been bewitched, allowing him to pursue his desires while maintaining his social standing and avoiding responsibility for breaking his vows. The impact on women's lives was devastating. Those who were beautiful, intelligent, or independent lived under constant threat of accusation. Many learned to deliberately make themselves less attractive, to hide their knowledge, to suppress their personalities in hopes of avoiding suspicion. Others retreated into religious life, seeking protection within convent walls, where their rejection of romantic love could be seen as holy rather than suspicious. But perhaps most tragically, these beliefs poisoned the very experience of love itself. In a world where passionate affection was viewed as evidence of demonic influence, where strong attraction was seen as proof of supernatural manipulation, genuine romantic connection became nearly impossible. Couples who might have found joy and fulfillment in each other's company instead lived in constant fear that their feelings were either sinful or artificial, the product of dark magic rather than natural human emotion. The psychological damage was immense. People learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potentially evil or false. The spontaneous joy of new love, the comfort of long partnership, the excitement of mutual attraction, all were tainted by the constant worry that these feelings might be the devil's work. Love, which should have been a source of happiness and connection, became instead a minefield of spiritual danger and social suspicion. Even successful relationships were shadowed by these fears. Couples who genuinely cared for each other had to constantly prove that their affection was natural and godly rather than the result of enchantment. They were expected to demonstrate appropriate restraint, to show that their love served God and society rather than selfish passion. The simple act of enjoying one's spouse too much could raise suspicions about the supernatural nature of the relationship. This created a culture where emotional authenticity was not just discouraged but actively dangerous. People learned to perform the approved forms of affection while hiding their true feelings, leading to relationships built on fear and pretense rather than genuine connection. The children who Yukawa grew up in such an environment inherited these fears and suspicions, perpetuating a cycle where each generation learned to view love through the lens of spiritual warfare. Young people received their first lessons about romance not through gentle guidance about healthy relationships but through warnings about the demonic dangers of passion and the need to constantly guard against supernatural seduction. The suffocating grip of superstition cast an even darker shadow over medieval romance than the physical and social constraints we've already explored. In a world where the line between the natural and supernatural remained dangerously thin, love itself became suspect, viewed through a lens of fear that transformed tender feelings into potential evidence of demonic interference or witchcraft. Medieval society lived in perpetual terror of unseen forces. Every unexplained event, every sudden illness, every stroke of misfortune could be attributed to malevolent supernatural intervention. Nowhere was this paranoia more destructive than in matters of the heart. Love, with its mysterious power to transform behavior and inspire seemingly irrational actions, appeared to medieval minds as a force that could only be explained through supernatural means. Consider the plight of Eleanor, a young merchant's daughter in 14th century France. When she began displaying the telltale signs of romantic infatuation, gazing dreamily into the distance, losing her appetite, and speaking in passionate whispers about the blacksmith's apprentice, her family didn't see the natural bloom of young love. Instead, they saw the unmistakable symptoms of demonic possession or enchantment. Eleanor's father immediately called for the local priest, convinced that his daughter had fallen under a malevolent spell. This wasn't an isolated incident of paranoid overreaction. Medieval medical texts actually described love as a form of mental illness, called love sickness or erotic melancholy, symptoms of which supposedly included the very behaviors we now recognize as normal romantic attraction. The influential physician, Constantine the African, wrote extensively about love as a dangerous disease that could drive sufferers to madness, violence, or death. When someone exhibited signs of romantic passion, medieval society often responded not with understanding or support, but with fear and fear. Attempts at supernatural intervention. The Church played a particularly sinister role in fostering these superstitious terrors. Religious authorities routinely preached that romantic love represented a dangerous departure from proper Christian devotion. They warned that passionate feelings could open the soul to demonic influence, making lovers vulnerable to Satan's temptations. Young people were taught to be suspicious of their own emotions, to view romantic desire as potentially sinful or even diabolical. This religious paranoia created a climate where expressing romantic feelings became an act of considerable courage. A young man composing love poetry risked being accused of practicing dark arts. A woman who showed too much enthusiasm for a suitor might find herself suspected of witchcraft. The very intensity that makes love beautiful became, in medieval minds, evidence of supernatural corruption. The fear of love magic pervaded every level of society. Wealthy nobles employed food tasters not just to guard against poison, but to detect love potions that might compromise their judgment in marriage negotiations. Merchants kept careful watch over their daughters, worried that rivals might use supernatural means to manipulate romantic attachments for business advantage. Even peasants lived in terror that their romantic rivals might employ cunning women or wise men to cast spells that would steal away their beloved's affections. These fears weren't entirely baseless within the medieval worldview. A thriving underground economy existed around love magic, with cunning folk hedge witches and folk healers offering potions, charms, and spells designed to kindle, enhance, or destroy romantic feelings. While these practitioners were often simply herbalists using natural aphrodisiacs or psychological manipulation, medieval society saw them as wielding genuinely supernatural powers. The consequences of this superstitious terror were devastating for ordinary people trying to navigate romance. Young lovers found themselves caught between their natural feelings and a society that viewed those feelings as potentially demonic. They had to hide their emotions, suppress their passions, and constantly worry that their love might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Margaret of Wessex, a 15th century wool merchant's daughter, left behind a diary that provides haunting insight into this psychological torment. She wrote of her love for a young clerk named Thomas, but her entries are filled with self-doubt and terror. She constantly questioned whether her feelings were natural or the result of some malevolent spell. She prayed daily for God to cleanse her heart of what she feared might be demonic influence. When Thomas began returning her affections, she became convinced that she had somehow corrupted him through supernatural means. This internalized fear created a vicious cycle. The more intensely someone experienced love, the more convinced they became that supernatural forces were at work. This led to guilt, self-loathing, and attempts to suppress or deny romantic feelings. Young people were taught to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potential evidence of spiritual corruption. The superstitious terror surrounding love also provided convenient weapons for those seeking to destroy romantic relationships. Jealous rivals could destroy a courtship simply by spreading rumors of love magic. Parents opposed to a match could claim their child had been enchanted. Spurned lovers could seek revenge by accusing their former beloved of practicing witchcraft. These accusations carried terrifying consequences. Suspected practitioners of love magic faced trials that often involved torture designed to extract confessions. The procedures for detecting love magic were barbaric and often fatal. Accused women might be subjected to swimming tests where they were bound and thrown into water on the theory that witches would float while innocent women would sink. They faced pricking tests where investigators searched their bodies for supernatural marks that supposedly proved their guilt. Even when formal accusations weren't made, the fear of love magic created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia. Couples had to be extraordinarily careful about how they expressed their feelings, worried that too much passion might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. They lived in fear that rejected suitors or jealous rivals might spread rumors that would destroy not just their relationship, but their reputations and possibly their lives. The documentation from medieval witch trials reveals the devastating impact of these superstitious terrors on romantic relationships. In case after case, we see love affairs destroyed by accusations of magic. Young women were burned at the stake for the crime of being too attractive, too charming, or too successful in matters of the heart. Men found themselves accused of using supernatural means to seduce women above their social station. The trial records of Agnes Waterhouse, executed in 1566 for witchcraft, illustrate this pattern perfectly. Agnes was accused of using magic to make various men fall in love with her, to break up established relationships, and to cause impotence in men who rejected her advances. The evidence against her consisted primarily of testimony that she was unusually successful in romantic matters and that several men had developed strong feelings for her. In a society where female romantic agency was viewed with suspicion, Agnes' apparent ability to attract and influence men was interpreted as proof of supernatural powers. This case demonstrates how the superstitious terrors surrounding love particularly targeted women. In medieval thinking, women were seen as more susceptible to demonic influence and more likely to use supernatural means to achieve their goals. A woman who was too beautiful, too charming, or too successful in love automatically became suspect. Female romantic agency was so threatening to medieval patriarchal structures that it was literally demonized. The fear of love magic also created terrible situations for women who were naturally attractive or charismatic. Beauty itself became suspect, viewed as potentially supernatural in origin. Women learned to downplay their appearance and suppress their natural charm, worried that too much success in romantic matters might lead to accusations of witchcraft. This superstitious terror extended beyond individual relationships to poison entire communities. Villages lived in constant fear that cunning women among them be practicing love magic. Neighbors watched each other suspiciously, looking for signs of supernatural romantic manipulation. The slightest unusual romantic development, a sudden infatuation, an unexpected marriage, a broken engagement, could trigger investigations and accusations. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat cannot be overstated. Young people grew up learning to distrust their own emotions, to view romantic love as potentially dangerous and possibly demonic. They internalized fears that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. How could someone fully open their heart when they'd been taught that romantic passion might be evidence of supernatural corruption? These superstitious terrors also created terrible dilemmas for people experiencing genuine love. They had to choose between following their hearts and protecting themselves from accusations of magic. Many chose safety over love, suppressing their feelings and entering into loveless but socially acceptable marriages. Others risked everything for love, knowing that their passion might be interpreted as evidence of demonic influence. The documentation of medieval love magic trials reveals the creative cruelty of a society determined to control and suppress romantic feelings. Accused practitioners faced interrogations designed to extract confessions of supernatural activities. They were asked to explain how they had learned their magical arts, to name their demonic allies, and to confess to specific acts of romantic manipulation. The torture methods used in these investigations were particularly horrific because they were designed to extract confessions that would justify the accuser's superstitious beliefs. Women were subjected to sleep deprivation, physical torture, and psychological manipulation until they would confess to anything. The resulting testimonies, extracted under extreme duress, were then used as evidence that love magic was real and widespread. These forced confessions created a self-perpetuating cycle of terror. Each tortured confession provided evidence that supported society's superstitious beliefs about love magic. This evidence was then used to justify more investigations, more tortures, and more executions. The documentation from these trials was circulated widely, spreading paranoia and providing templates for future accusations. The superstitious terror surrounding medieval romance reached its peak during the great witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries. During this period, thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for practicing magic, and a significant proportion of these cases involved accusations of love magic. The famous Malleus Maleficarum, the handbook for witch hunters published in 1487, devoted extensive sections to detecting and prosecuting love magic. This systematic persecution created a climate where romantic love became literally life-threatening. Young people learned that expressing passion too openly or successfully attracting romantic partners could lead to accusations of witchcraft. They lived in constant fear that their natural emotions might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. The economic dimension of these superstitious terrors added another layer of horror to medieval romance. Accusations of love magic became tools for economic warfare. Successful merchants might find their daughters accused of using supernatural charms to attract wealthy suitors. Prosperous widows who remarried could face claims that they had enchanted their new husbands. Even peasant women who managed to marry above their station risked accusations that they had used magic to seduce their husbands. These economic motivations meant that accusations of love magic often targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Poor women who had somehow achieved romantic success found themselves particularly suspect. Their inability to afford legal representation or social protection made them easy targets for accusations that could result in property confiscation, exile, or death. The intersection of superstitious terror with medieval romance also reveals the deep-seated fear of female sexuality that permeated medieval society. Women who displayed sexual agency or romantic initiative were automatically suspect. They were seen as potentially using supernatural means to overcome the natural, male dominance that medieval society considered proper. This fear of female romantic agency led to the development of elaborate tests and procedures designed to detect supernatural influence in romantic relationships. Church authorities developed questionnaires to determine whether romantic feelings were natural or magically induced. They looked for signs like sudden onset of passion, intensity of feeling, or romantic success that exceeded what they considered natural for a person's social status or physical attractiveness. The documentation from medieval communities reveals how these superstitious terrors poisoned relationships between neighbors, friends, and family members. People learned to be suspicious of each other's romantic successes. They watched for signs that others might be using supernatural means to achieve romantic goals. Community gatherings became opportunities for surveillance and suspicion rather than celebration and connection. The psychological warfare inherent in these superstitious systems was particularly cruel. Accused individuals faced not just legal consequences, but complete social isolation. Their friends and family members, terrified of being associated with suspected practitioners of magic, would abandon them. Even those who escaped formal prosecution often found their lives destroyed by suspicion and social ostracism. The religious dimensions of medieval superstitious terror created additional layers of psychological torment for people experiencing romantic love. They were taught that their feelings might be sinful, that romantic passion could damn their souls, and that they needed to constantly examine their emotions for signs of demonic influence. This created a form of spiritual torture where people learned to distrust and fear their own hearts. The medical establishment of medieval Europe contributed to these superstitious terrors by providing seemingly scientific explanations for the supernatural nature of romantic love. Physicians wrote extensively about love as a form of madness caused by supernatural influences. They developed elaborate theories about how demons could manipulate human emotions and prescribed treatments that often involved exorcism or other religious interventions. These medical theories gave scholarly legitimacy to popular superstitions about love magic. When learned physicians confirmed that romantic passion could be caused by supernatural influences, it became much easier for ordinary people to believe that their neighbors might be practicing love magic. The fusion of medical authority with superstitious belief created a particularly powerful and destructive form of paranoia. The legal systems of medieval Europe developed elaborate procedures for prosecuting love magic, creating bureaucratic machinery for destroying romantic relationships. Courts developed standardized methods for investigating accusations, interrogating suspects, and determining guilt or innocence. These procedures gave the appearance of legal legitimacy to what were essentially exercises in superstitious persecution. The documentation from these legal proceedings reveals the systematic nature of the terror surrounding medieval romance. Accusations followed predictable patterns. Investigations used standard techniques, and punishments were carefully calibrated to create maximum deterrent effect. This wasn't random persecution, but an organized campaign to control and suppress romantic feelings through fear. The international nature of these superstitious terrors meant that people couldn't escape them by moving to different regions or countries. The fear of love magic spread across medieval Europe, creating a continental climate of romantic paranoia. Trade routes and pilgrimage paths carried not just goods and people but also superstitious beliefs and persecution techniques. This widespread nature of romantic superstition meant that medieval people lived under a constant cloud of fear that could follow them anywhere. A young couple might flee their home village to escape accusations of love magic only to find the same suspicions and dangers in their new community. There was literally nowhere in medieval Europe where romantic love was entirely safe from superstitious persecution. As we examine the devastating impact of superstitious terror on medieval romance, we see how fear and paranoia poisoned what should have been humanity's most beautiful and natural experiences. Love, which should bring joy and connection, became a source of terror and danger. Young people learned to suppress their deepest emotions and distrust their own hearts. Communities turned against their own members based on nothing more than successful romantic relationships. The legacy of these medieval superstitious terrors extended far beyond the Middle Ages, creating cultural patterns of sexual shame and romantic fear that persisted for centuries. The idea that passionate love might be supernatural or dangerous, that female romantic agency was inherently suspect, that successful relationships required explanation beyond natural attraction, these beliefs shaped European culture for generations. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not just how far we've come in accepting romantic love as natural and beautiful, but also how deeply embedded these superstitious fears became in Western culture. The medieval terror of love magic may seem distant and foreign to us now, but its echoes can still be found in modern anxieties about sexuality, romance, and emotional expression. The brave individuals who risked everything for love during these dark centuries, who chose to follow their hearts despite the supernatural dangers surrounding them, deserve our admiration. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest times, the human heart persists in seeking connection, defying the forces that would crush it. The pervasive fear of love magic in medieval Europe didn't just affect individual relationships, it reshaped entire communities, creating a culture where trust was eroded and suspicion became the norm. The belief that love could be manipulated by supernatural forces meant that every romantic success story was scrutinized for signs of witchcraft. A young woman who married well might be accused of enchanting her husband. A man who won the affection of a higher-born lady could be suspected of using charms or demonic aid. These accusations weren't just personal vendettas. They were weapons in broader social and economic battles. A rival family could ruin a competitor's reputation by whispering about love spells. A jealous suitor could destroy a woman's life with a single accusation. The fear of supernatural interference in romance turned neighbors into spies and friends into potential accusers. The Church's role in perpetuating this paranoia cannot be overstated. Sermons regularly warned of the dangers of uncontrolled passion, painting love as a gateway to sin and demonic possession. Priests instructed their flocks to report any suspicious behavior, particularly among women who were seen as more susceptible to the devil's influence. This created a surveillance culture where private moments of affection were subject to public scrutiny. A couple caught stealing a kiss behind a haystack could find themselves hauled before a church court, accused of succumbing to or wielding supernatural forces. The church's obsession with controlling sexuality meant that even married couples weren't safe. Excessive affection between spouses was viewed as unnatural, potentially evidence of magical manipulation. A husband who doted too much on his wife might be questioned about whether she had bewitched him. A wife who seemed too eager for her husband's company could face accusations of using love potions to maintain his affection. This paranoia was reinforced by the legal system, which treated accusations of love magic with deadly seriousness. Court records from the period show how flimsy the evidence could be. A woman might be condemned based on nothing more than a neighbor's testimony that she had been seen gathering herbs at midnight, or that her beauty seemed unnatural. The Coti, infamous Malleus Maleficarum 1487, a manual for witch hunters, provided detailed instructions on identifying and prosecuting those suspected of using magic to influence romantic feelings. It described love magic as one of the most common and dangerous forms of witchcraft, claiming that women used spells to inflame men with lust or to bind their affections unnaturally. The text's influence spread across Europe, legitimizing the persecution of anyone whose romantic life seemed too successful or unconventional. The economic impact of these accusations was profound. Property was often confiscated from those convicted of witchcraft, and accusations of love magic were a convenient way to target wealthy widows or successful families. A woman who inherited land or wealth after her husband's death was particularly vulnerable. If she remarried quickly or attracted multiple suitors, she might be accused of using magic to secure her new marriage. The accusers, often rival families or greedy neighbors, stood to gain her property if she was convicted. This turned love itself into a battleground for economic warfare, where genuine affection could lead to financial ruin. The psychological toll of living under this constant threat was immense. Young people learned to suppress their emotions, to hide their feelings, to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural influence. A woman who smiled too readily at a suitor risked being labeled a temptress. A man who pursued a woman with too much fervor might be suspected of being under a spell. This created a culture of emotional repression, where the natural joy of falling in love was replaced with fear and self-doubt. Couples who managed to form genuine bonds had to navigate a minefield of social expectations, religious prohibitions, and legal dangers. Their love had to be expressed in secret, behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of a society ready to see witchcraft in every tender glance. The literature of the time reflects this tension. Medieval romances, while often celebrating the idea of passionate love, were filled with warnings about its dangers. Stories like that of Tristan and Isolde, who fall in love after accidentally drinking a love potion, underscore the medieval belief that true passion was unnatural and likely the result of magical interference. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were cautionary stories, teaching audiences that love was a dangerous force that could destroy lives, reputations, and even kingdoms. The tragic endings of these stories, lovers separated, exiled, or dead, reinforced the idea that passionate love was doomed to fail, either through divine punishment or supernatural betrayal. Yet, Despite this suffocating atmosphere of superstition, there were those who defied the fear and pursued love with courage. Secret letters, hidden meetings, and whispered vows persisted in the face of overwhelming odds. Some couples risked everything to be together, knowing that discovery could mean accusations of witchcraft or worse. Others found ways to subvert the system, using the church's own rituals to protect their relationships. For example, some couples would exchange private vows in secret, claiming a clandestine marriage that was legally binding under canon law, even if their families disapproved. These acts of defiance show the resilience of the human spirit, the refusal to let fear extinguish the desire for connection. The legacy of the superstitious terror lingered long after the medieval period. The witch hunts of the early modern era, which claimed tens of thousands of lives, were built on the foundation of medieval fears about love and sexuality. The idea that women were inherently dangerous, that their beauty or charm could be tools of the devil, persisted in European culture for centuries. Even today, we see echoes of these beliefs in the way society sometimes demonizes female sexuality or views passionate love with suspicion. The medieval fear of love magic reminds us how deeply cultural anxieties can shape our understanding of human emotions, turning something as natural as love into a source of terror and persecution. As we draw this exploration of medieval dating nightmares to a close, it's worth reflecting on how these brutal realities shape not just the lives of those who lived through them, but also the way we think about love today. The medieval period, with its oppressive social structures, deadly physical dangers, and suffocating superstitions, created a world where love was a high-stakes gamble, fraught with peril at every turn. Yet, paradoxically, it was also the era that gave birth to the Western concept of romantic love, an idea that continues to influence our relationships, our literature, and our culture. The tradition of courtly love, born in the courts of medieval Europe, introduced the notion that love could be a noble, transformative force, even if it was often unattainable or tragic. This was a radical departure from earlier views of marriage as a purely practical arrangement. The troubadours and poets who sang of knights pining for their ladies created a template for romantic longing that still resonates in our songs, movies, and stories. The idea that love should be passionate, all-consuming, and even a little dangerous owes much to these medieval origins. When we swoon over a dramatic love story or feel that love isn't real unless it's intense and complicated, we're echoing the medieval belief that true love is defined by its obstacles. But this romantic ideal came at a cost. The medieval emphasis on unattainable love, on passion that could never be fully realized, set a precedent for viewing healthy, stable relationships as somehow less authentic. The tortured romances of Lancelot and Guinevere, or Abelard and Heloise, became the gold standard, while practical, companionate marriages were seen as mundane. This legacy persists in modern culture, where we often romanticize dysfunctional relationships and undervalue the quiet, steady love that sustains long-term partnerships. The medieval period also left us with a complicated inheritance regarding gender and power in relationships. The rigid patriarchal structures of the time, reinforced by the church and feudal system, placed women in a subordinate role, their desires and agency often erased or demonized. The fear of female sexuality, encapsulated in accusations of love magic and witchcraft, created a cultural template that justified controlling women's bodies and choices. While we've made significant strides toward gender equality, traces of these medieval attitudes still linger in societal expectations about women's behavior in romantic contexts. The economic and political dimensions of medieval marriage also shaped our modern understanding of relationships. The idea that marriage is a partnership with practical implications, shared finances, social status, family alliances has its roots in the medieval view of marriage as a strategic transaction. While we now prioritize personal choice and emotional connection, the medieval legacy reminds us that love has always been intertwined with broader social and economic realities. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from medieval romance is the resilience of the human heart. Despite the overwhelming obstacles, disease, violence, superstition, and social control, people continued to fall in love, to write poetry, to risk everything for a chance at connection. The stories of those who defied their society's constraints, who loved fiercely in the face of death and danger, are a testament to the enduring power of human emotion. Their courage reminds us that love, in any era, requires bravery, whether it's navigating the perils of a medieval village or the complexities of a modern dating app. As we reflect on these medieval dating nightmares, we can appreciate how far we've come. Modern medicine has reduced the mortal dangers of childbirth and disease. Legal protections and social changes have given individuals, particularly women, far greater agency in their romantic lives. The decline of superstitious fears has freed us to view love as a natural, human experience rather than a potential sign of demonic influence. Yet, the medieval period also reminds us to stay vigilant against the ways fear, control, and misunderstanding can distort something as fundamental as love. The ghosts of medieval romance, its impossible ideals, its brutal realities, its courageous lovers still haunt our cultural imagination, urging us to cherish the freedom to love openly and to build relationships grounded in mutual respect and genuine connection. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dark and fascinating world of medieval romance. If this story has resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts, perhaps about a historical love story that moves you or a modern dating challenge that echoes these ancient struggles. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope this tale has brought you a moment of reflection and peace. Until next time, may your heart find its own brave path through the complexities of love.